would be a crucial one in the 6-week war with Iran. The clock is ticking toward the president's deadline of 8 p.m. Eastern tonight for Iran to make a deal that he deems sufficient or face death and destruction. But then, at 8:06 a.m. Eastern, the president took what was already a series of profane and stark warnings to a new apocalyptic level. These are the commander-in-chief's exact words. Quote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. However, now that we have complete and total regime change where different, smarter, and less radicalized minds prevail, maybe something revolutionarily wonderful can happen. Who knows? We will find out tonight, one of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world. 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death will finally end. God bless the great people of Iran." Now, we have gotten used to President Trump's over-the-top rhetoric, but for a president of the United States to warn that a, quote, "whole civilization will die tonight" is a sentence that cannot, should not be shrugged off as a classic Trump statement or even a negotiating tactic, even if that was his intent. I'm joined by a terrific group of reporters on this potentially very important day here. Phil Mattingly?
You're just going to tee me up?
Yep.
Based off that? Here's what I think is important going into tonight, stepping back and actually stepping away just momentarily from kind of the rhetorical warfare the president has launched over the course of the last couple of days via social media. The president right now is obviously amping up the escalatory rhetoric to the highest level he possibly can, whether it be profanity or threatening mass murder of a civilization, while also saying God bless the people of Iran who are integral to that civilization. The reality is there are no good options right now for the president of the United States, given what his goals were heading into this, and given the realities, the dynamics right now, in particular the Strait of Hormuz, which we spent so much time talking about over the course of the last couple of weeks. If the president decides to go through with his targeting of electric grid's power infrastructure, the Iranians will immediately retaliate, hitting Gulf countries' electric grid's power infrastructure. The spiral from that will create a much more expansive regional conflict that will also have a dramatic and substantial effect on the global economy, global energy prices, domestic gas prices at home, that will make what we've seen the last 6 weeks look relatively minor in scale. That has always been kind of the paradox of this moment for him. For him to escalate and push this even further as he's threatened would immediately put on the brink the issue that he is cared most deeply about throughout both of his terms in the White House. And so that has been the dynamic he's been dealing with. It's why he's continued to extend deadlines, to continue to look for some type of deal. And the question right now going into this is Iran going to call his bluff? Is he calling Iran's bluff? And if they're both calling one another's bluffs, are we about to wander into a place where this gets much larger, much more expansive, and much more dangerous than it already is in a very precarious position?
The vice president is in Hungary today, which we'll talk about more later in the program. But with regard to Iran, here's what he said about the conflict.
I hope that they're smart. The president has set a deadline for about 12 hours from now in the United States. We're going to find out, but there's going to be a lot of negotiation between now and then, and I'm hopeful that it gets to a good resolution.
Well, he apparently isn't part of that negotiation because he's in Hungary and he's rallying there for the nation's prime minister. So, we've heard a lot about this negotiation from the president, and every time he talks about it, the Iranians come back and say, there is no deal, the Strait of Hormuz is going to remain closed. He wants to portray it like the folks who are there in power are much more lenient and reasonable and smarter than the people who the Americans wiped out, but they're much more entrenched, much more hardline at this point, partly because the father was killed, all of the leaders, the mother, and so we're in this position where it's hard to believe what the American president says. Oftentimes with this, there have been several rounds of these. Negotiations are going well, extension of deadlines. Is that what we're looking at tonight, right? So, we're just in uncharted, unprecedented territory where, in many ways, it's easier to believe what the Iranians have to say about the negotiations. Essentially, that there is no negotiation and that there is no sort of forward movement at this point. But we'll see in a number of hours.
It seems like, I mean, and I'd like to know what you're hearing from your sources. It seems like there are negotiations, but the question is, how do you define that? Because they don't seem to be direct. They're through emissaries and so on. You mentioned, Nia, the fact that there have been several deadlines that the president has set and then moved the goalposts. Let's just look at some examples of what we're talking about. Starting on March 21st, he gave a 48-hour ultimatum. 2 days later, 5-day extension. 3 days after that, a 10-day extension. And then 4 days later, March 30th, a new ultimatum if the deal is not shortly reached. And then we land where we are today, this deadline at 8 p.m. Eastern tonight.
We've all at this table covered President Trump for a long time. One of his rhetorical tics, I think you can say, is to throw out a 2-week or 3-week or a 2-day or whatever it is deadline for whatever it is. In this case, it's a war. I think you were spot on to start out this show by saying you can't shrug off what he's saying today as just that, because it's talking about civilization. He's talking about human beings. He's talking about lives. He's centering himself and this country in a moment of world history that absolutely could be defining and tragic. That said, going back to the "we've all covered Donald Trump for a long time" the phrase, we know that it almost certainly is a negotiating tactic. He sees himself as a deal maker. He uses bombastic rhetoric, and he does it in order to bring people in the direction that he wants to go. Will that happen? Hard to say. He also said in the White House yesterday that the negotiations are tough because they don't really have a way to communicate. So how are you going to get a negotiation which, according to him, according to the President of the United States yesterday, is essentially being run by passing notes? How are you going to do that by 8 o'clock in order to prevent the end of civilization in Iran? He is raising all those questions with his descriptions.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see the various sort of off-ramps that he is eyeing
100%.
with this post, including the fact that he is claiming that this current regime is more reasonable than the last one, which he also said yesterday, and there's no evidence of that. But it's his way of saying, well, maybe we can kind of live with them if they make a couple of deals on a few things. Tucker Carlson is not certainly somebody who tends to be, certainly in recent years, the arbiter of somebody who is stable and accurate in the way that they approach the world. And yet, it is, I think, important in this moment to play what he said in reaction to the series of threats we've heard from the president in the last 48 hours or so with regard to Iran.
It is vile on every level. It begins with a promise to use the U.S. military, our military, to destroy civilian infrastructure in another country, which is to say to commit a war crime, a moral crime against the people of the country. Those people who are in direct contact with the president need to say, no, I'll resign. I'll do whatever I can do legally to stop this because this is insane. And if given the order, I'm not carrying it out.
Now, the president talked to the New York Post this morning, responding by calling Tucker a low IQ person who has no idea what's going on.
I think it was really instructive, and this has actually often been the case over the course of the last 6 weeks. As you're listening to administration officials talk about plans or talk about strategies, is listening to General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where he kind of walks through in very methodical and in some ways technocratic and logistical detail kind of how the military operation is running and what their goals are, what their objectives are, and perhaps what is still to be determined. And he was asked a question recently about basically, is this something you can do? This would constitute a war crime. How do you actually think through this if this order is given? And he gave an answer that did not directly address what the president has threatened repeatedly over and over again, but made very clear that the U.S. military has ethical and moral restrictions in terms of how they operate. They have lawyers that are overseeing all of their targeting packages and the strikes that they carry out. And that would be something that they would hew to, as they always do, based based on how the U.S. military operates. I think that's a notable response.